Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome, everyone, to the newest episode of Potted Men at Yale. I'm Ari Schaefer, Director of Communications here at the Buckley Institute and host of the podcast. Today, I'm joined by two panelists who have been on the podcast before, Arianne de Gennaro, a senior.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
And Owen Tilman, a sophomore.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me again.
Thanks so much for joining us. So Yale President Maura McGinnis announced she had accepted recommendations from a committee on institutional voice, is how she called it, generally advising that those speaking on behalf of Yale should refrain from commenting on political or social issues. First, what do you guys think of the decision overall? What do you think of the new guidelines? Arianne, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think I largely agreed with the guidelines. I think we'll get into this later. There are definitely a couple exceptions to the overall decision, which was that for the most part, leaders of the university should refrain from commenting on political or external issues. I agree for the most part with that. I don't think it's the university's responsibility to be coming down on one side or another for most external issues, especially given that the goal of an institution like Yale is to educate people on how to think, not what to think. I will say there was the caveat that people could comment or perhaps should comment on issues that were labeled, I think, transcendent. So I think when we are talking about what that means, there could be a lot of places where leaders would still be able to or be encouraged to comment on external issues.
How about you, Owen? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm definitely supportive of university policy that prevents leaders of the university from acting in their own capacity in the service of something political. And certainly given the level of, campus division over Israel, Gaza in the past year, and certainly now, happy election day, everybody. I certainly think that more than ever, it's important that, the university administrators and leaders abide by that. Obviously, that does not extend, however, to not imposing due penalties on students who cross legal boundaries, who violate the norms of a society that is dedicated to peaceful discourse. I'm sure we'll get into the House Education Committee's report on Yale and how they mishandled last year's campus protests, and to what extent there needs to be some sort of actual policy change to ensure that won't happen again. But yeah, I'm generally supportive of the neutrality.
And we will get to the report later. We'll talk a little bit more in depth. But there was, a lot of debate about institutional neutrality. There still is. Other universities, Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, have adopted some level of institutional neutrality. At Yale, particularly in the pages of the YDN, there was a lot of back and forth. There were two professors who called it a danger to free speech. There's faculty for Yale who, big supporters of institutional neutrality, believe it will help free speech. How do you guys see those two things interplaying? Institutional neutrality, Yale avoiding commenting on contentious political issues, and your own free speech as students?
Yeah, so I will say one of the pieces that was arguing for institutional neutrality was written by Anthony Kronman, who is a mentor of mine and I admire greatly. So I did agree with most of what he said in that piece, and I recommend reading it. To the sort of opposition to that, I think given what I know of the report, I don't see how it could be construed as a danger to free speech. I think that's a little extreme, considering it basically recommended that leaders in their capacity as leaders refrain from making statements that could be seen as statements on behalf of the entire community or on behalf of the institution that they are in charge of. It did specifically say that insofar as they are individuals or experts on a topic, they're allowed to discuss it. So I think we could have a conversation about perhaps how that would affect the discourse, right? But I think saying that it's a danger to free speech or limiting people actually from expressing their opinions is a little bit extreme.
So to that point, how do you guys think it'll affect your own free speech, right? I think some of the complaints were about how it'll affect faculty free speech or that the university wants to speak on these issues. do you feel that, when the university chimes in and says, this is how we feel, or when Yale or the president chimes in and says, this is how we feel about this particular issue, do you think either you or your friends, classmates feel a little bit of a pressure that, maybe that's the way you got to talk, or that's the position you got to take, or does it not bother you at all?
Yeah, I think that we have to point out, how these pro-free speech messages by the administration are often connoted, and especially in the past year, what it's really meant is, free speech is important, right? Because it allows liberal students to express opinions, and then really, really, really liberal students to express opinions. And very rarely will you hear the administration say, no, conservative speech needs to be protected on our campus too. It's important that conservative speakers, right, are able to come, express quote unquote controversial opinions, and then engage with the rest of the student body. So until they say something like that, until they explicitly say that we value political diversity, that our definition of diversity also includes political diversity. I tried running a YCC Senate campaign on that last year, and I got 4th place out of 5 people, because it was not a very popular message, and that's all the more reason for, I think, the administration to start taking a more proactive stance on that.
So one of the to that point, one of the things I've always, been a little conflicted about this move to institutional neutrality, which I do think will be good for higher education in America overall, but I can't help look at the context in which it came up. Or you talked about how this is about, extreme progressive opinion and slightly progressive opinion, and conservatives often don't get thrown into the mix. And it's hard not to notice that this institutional neutrality push came in to defend students who wanted to support the Hamas side, or even to a lesser extent, the more aggressive Palestinian side of the discussion on October 7th, or in post-October 7th, professors like Zarina Gruel who wanted to support what happened on that day. And it didn't seem to bother them until that was the side that needed to be protected. So I'm curious for your thoughts on, on that question. They're trying to protect free speech. Who's this move to protect free speech really protecting?
Yeah, this is something that I find incredibly frustrating, because going to Yale, but also I went to a pretty liberal school in New York City for high school. So for the past maybe almost decade of my life, I feel like I've been in these institutions where, for the most part, you were supposed to share a certain mainstream opinion, and if you didn't share it, you didn't speak. So it wouldn't have been considered acceptable in my high school to speak out against every student having to attend affinity groups. It wouldn't have been acceptable to speak out against creating gender-neutral bathrooms at my all-girls high school. And all sorts of things. I think we see this at Yale as well. And all of a sudden, now we care about free speech, when it seems that what it seems like to me is we are protecting speech that we deem to be correct or valuable, which is basically saying I'm right, so my side gets to speak. And I think at Yale, we see that coming from usually the left, because it is a majority liberal and even leftist space. I'm sure there are other spaces in which different opinions are holding that view, but what I've experienced is a majority liberal space. And yeah, it seems like it's free speech when it benefits the people who are the majority.
Yeah, I think it's pretty extraordinary that the free speech conversation on Yale's campus in the past year has become, is it genocidal to shout from the river to the sea and then say, it depends on the context. And meanwhile, at the Buckley Institute, a conversation about the sex binary has to be relegated to an exclusively conservative space because it would otherwise be completely unwelcome, right, on Yale's campus. Like, the insane double standard is, it's exactly that. The double standard is insane. And, it's really unfortunate, because I think that, for a lot of students on Yale's campus, they can honestly look at a call to annihilate the Jewish state and say, well, maybe I'm not particularly supportive of that. But given the fact that, given the fact that the administration, right, has not taken a proactive stance against that kind of rhetoric, they tend to think it's actually a more mainstream belief than it otherwise would be. And perhaps that's maybe a counter-argument to what I was originally saying about institutional neutrality, that, that the university should say that calling for the annihilation of the Jewish people or the Jewish state is in fact bad, and we will take action against that. But I think both can be true at the exact same time. The institution definitely should be neutral on questions of politics, but it should also have very clearly defined lines of accountability for the administrators, faculty, and students.
So I do want to talk about one thing that Arianne referenced before, the kind of caveat in the guidelines. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a free speech advocacy organization, called it a loophole that's ripe for abuse. Basically, the third leg of these guidelines is that university officials should comment to express empathy on external matters and transcendent cases, I think was the language that President McInnes highlighted. They can comment when necessary, although the caveat is that they should avoid being political and do so. In doing so, what do you guys make of this exception? Is it basically a giant get-out-of-jail-free card for Yale, or do you think it was just a sincere way to be able to talk about sensitive issues without violating their guidelines?
See, I'm conflicted because on principle, I agree that there are some issues that should be able to be commented on and that not be seen as political. I will say one of those issues for me was after October 7th. I think condemning October 7th would have been what I would deem a transcendent issue. I think we saw how that played out. People thought it was political. And even though I still hold that that is a transcendent issue, that should be an apolitical issue, I can see people saying the same thing for any number of perspectives and designating anything that they care about to be something that needs to be commented on. I have to presume that the response to this report is going to be some people saying, for example, genocide is one of these transcendent issues, and using terms like that to push forth whatever they believe without really exploring if that's an accurate term to describe things that are going on in the world. But yeah, so that's why, again, I agree with the principle, but in practice, I think that somewhat puts the conversation back to where we were before.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that, the university campus, including Yale's, right, in the West has always been a very liberal place. Obviously, campus protests are nothing new. I'm thinking of Vietnam. I'm thinking of other instances in which the campuses have blown up over foreign events, right? But it didn't have it was a different situation in as much as students were not protesting, right, in favor of people who were very openly advocating the genocide of a particular identity group, right? And I think that this is probably the best example of the hypocrisy on the issue. Is what we're approaching a year anniversary of the Congressional testimony of the three college presidents, which shook the world, right, and got all three of them, I believe, kicked out of their positions. With I think the exception of MIT.
I think two of them
did. Yeah, UPenn and Harvard left, but yeah. And you think to yourself, it's like, okay, well, is calling for the annihilation of the Jewish people protected under Harvard free speech protections? And the college president says depends on the context. Now, from what I heard, all three presidents were actually prepared by the same law firm, for that testimony, and that was the answer that the lawyer said is the most legally correct. So the objection, to be clear, to something like that is not that it's incorrect. It's that if this question were framed or contextualized to any other identity group, the answer would be very different. And that's incredibly I'm ethnically Jewish. I'm not religiously Jewish, but it's angering, right? To somebody like me, it's angering to people with common sense that there's that insane double standard, because it seems that anti-Semitism is one of those last acceptable forms of bigotry.
And I think really what it comes down to is this is like the most extreme example of taking this ideology of like oppressed versus oppressor to the extreme. I think that we've been taught to believe that certain groups are oppressed, that people of color are oppressed, and that white people are oppressors. And if Jews or Ashkenazi Jews are considered white, they therefore are the oppressors and not the oppressed. And this binary, there's some truth, obviously, in how history has played out, but taken to its extremes, it's absolutely ridiculous. And it's basically deciding who deserves protection from hatred based on the color of their skin. And yeah, I think that Owen put it very, very well in terms of the hypocrisy and the double standard.
So you mentioned the presidents, of these other Ivy League universities, where a couple months into President McInnes's tenure, one of the first things she did was convene this committee on institutional voice that came out with these new guidelines. which she accepted. Do you guys think this is a good sign for her tenure going forward?
I mean, I think it's a good sign and also probably a smart move. She saw that a lot of the new presidents who had been appointed made statements on issues or felt pressured to make statements on larger issues, and then now they're out. So I think the report also puts that if Yale has this statement, if the assumption is not speaking, then it kind of guards Yale against people who will claim, oh, but neutrality is a statement in itself. Yale's basically saying, no, this is the norm. So don't take this as a position. And people can do whatever they want then. They can think it's a position, but it definitely gives Yale a much stronger shield if they don't take a position. And I think it gives McGinnis and her administration a lot more leeway to just not comment, which I personally think is probably good for her and also the student body. And elaborating on that point, I think with what we've been saying about double standards, this is why I think that the principle of this report is so important, because the limit to free speech, it's interesting because I think people think the only way to limit free speech is to say you can't say that. But on a university campus, which has this social dimension, there's a sense in which when an opinion is just not like sanctioned by the majority of your peers, or more importantly by your university, that you feel like you can't say it. And I think that's what we saw starting to happen last spring with the protests. People who either stood with Israel or just were Israeli or even were Jewish felt like they weren't allowed to express beliefs that were fundamental to their identity. And that minority opinions being alienated is always a bad thing. So I think the university taking a stance where they're not going to sanction one belief over another is, for the most part, a very good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree. Just today, actually, the joint opinion outlet, the Publius, right, which split off from the YDN, I forget how long ago, published an article entitled "We're Jealous of Our Conservative Peers." And the article was actually pretty fantastic, and it delved into, it is true that many conservative students feel, alienated and ostracized, right? Exactly what Arianne was saying, largely by those social dimensions, in which, people sort of indirectly censor, right? By, alienating you from your social group, posting mean things about you on Fizz. That's happened to me before. It's a lot of fun. But their point was, it also puts a majority of the campus being liberal at a massive disadvantage, because what it means is they're not gonna get to sharpen their beliefs in the way that conservative students do. I can personally attest to this. I'm constantly surrounded by people who do not agree with me at all on anything, and I'm in a constant state of defending my beliefs and having to package them in a way that's palatable to somebody who thinks that I'm, a bigot, somebody who thinks that I'm a racist. I'm none of those things, right? And yes, it's a little bit difficult at times, but it also makes me a lot stronger than I otherwise would be. And I think in as much as institutional neutrality means, kind of discouraging by omission conversations that otherwise would have taken place, right? If you had taken a very proactively pro-free speech position, right, saying, yeah, we accept liberal speech, we also accept conservative speech. Talk amongst yourselves on our campus. That's what we're for. Then I think that liberal students would not be at such a disadvantage, but I think that they are now.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I've had the same experience as someone who considers myself a liberal person on the national spectrum, but at Yale, definitely a conservative.
Right.
I think people think that I went to the polls today and voted for Trump. And I mean, if I did, that would be fine, but that is not, they're assuming this because of, I guess things I write, the fact that I appear on this podcast, probably.
Yes.
The other thing is, it really begs the question, why do students at Yale feel like they need the university itself to sanction their beliefs in order for them to continue protesting, or for that protesting to have an effect? Or, I just don't understand why they need that approval on all of these issues.
So I do want to get to the protests. As Owen mentioned, the Congressional Committee, the House of Representatives Committee on Education and Workforce, put out a report recently. A report said that since October 7th, 2023, Yale, quote, has suspended no students, placed only 2 students on disciplinary probation, and reprimanded 23 students, notwithstanding students protests blocking traffic, blocking campus to Jewish students, vandalism around campus, reports of anti-Semitism, and one student being assaulted. You guys were on campus last semester. Does that track with what you guys saw, what you guys experienced?
It was horrifying. I mean, what I saw in Beinecke Plaza was nothing short of the larva stage of a death cult. And that sounds insane. And now, look, the truth of the matter is that sounds insane, and it largely is because, look, a lot of these people just genuinely don't know what they're talking about. It's like every other social justice cause ever, it'll die. It has a half-life of about a month. People get so intense about it, and then it ceases all relevance, right? So obviously, no, that's not entirely true. But it was very freaky to watch, one student, say a line, and then everyone else repeats in unison, and you just cycle through that, and it's incredibly disturbing to watch that, because it's like they have no clue what they're saying, but what they're saying is so genuinely horrifying, not to mention completely inaccurate. Jews are settler colonists in the land of Israel. Hamas militants are, freedom fighters rather than genocidal agents of fundamentalist religion, right? That is seeing people do that, right, just so blithely and with eyes, completely closed, was horrifying to watch on Beinecke Plaza. And then, yes, it escalated into actual violence, and that was 2 or 3 days after people started setting up encampments. And as you mentioned, a student was assaulted. Jewish students were prevented from crossing certain parts of campus unless they, they pledged themselves to the commandments of Free Palestine. And it was genuinely horrifying to watch that. And I don't think that the university did its job.
Yeah, I think I also had a pretty negative experience being on campus in the protests. And it wasn't necessarily because I thought all of my peers were evil or supported horrible things. It was more the sense that there were probably a few people that had very strong beliefs I strongly disagreed with, but then there were a lot of my peers who I felt just had joined in. There was something so just strange and eerie about walking past Beinecke and hearing the crowd just roar and the ebb and flow of that. I remember standing with one of my friends who's Israeli. She's liberal Israeli, and she has a lot of qualms with the current government. And we were standing outside Beinecke Plaza, and she was just on the verge of tears because she felt like she would not be welcome anywhere near the space, and it was scaring her that she felt like all these people opposed literally her identity. So again, I think it comes from a place of misunderstanding for most people, but it is extremely scary to me that this kind of demonstration becomes so fun. I think it's a jump on the bandwagon kind of thing, and there were so many people there, and I feel like it was not fostering discussion in a way that I think could have been productive.
So how much of this is, students in college protest? That's a quintessential experience. Well, we've been hearing it nonstop since the 60s and 70s, but you really only, don't really see it that often. Just everyone talks about the 60s and 70s when it happened. So how much of this is Yale students protest? And so Yale and universities should kind of let it go because that's part of the experience. And, how much should Yale be thinking about, your friend and, you guys who are looking at these protests and going I'm a student here too. I should feel safe too. I should feel comfortable too. Why does that not matter?
I mean, I think this is why the best thing to do is just have standards that are applicable to anyone speaking about anything. In this case, there were obviously university regulations regarding campus structures or how long you can stay out in a certain space, whether you can block that space. And I think that those regulations need to be followed, and the university needs to probably take a harsher stance when those regulations are not followed. I say it just because I think it becomes too difficult for the university to regulate what kinds of messages, short of very explicit bigotry, I guess. It's very complicated to decide what is worthy of being protested, and I think the university should be a space where all of those ideas can be discussed, even if I don't agree with them at all.
So I do want to build on something you pointed out and talked about before. So of the 45 students who were arrested for refusing to leave campus, none were suspended, and only one received probation. Yale formally reprimanded, whatever that means, 23 students overall, according to the report, and has open disciplinary cases against another 22. Do you think they should have done more?
I mean, I will say yes in principle. I mean, if I don't know, the specific cases or what specific charges were, so I'll reserve a more specific claim for the time that I actually know what I'm talking about. But I will say this, right? I think it was the day of the mass arrests at 6 a.m. I think it was April 21st, 22nd, or something like that. And there were videos circulating in my Instagram feed from a bunch of Yale students of the students getting arrested, some violence that had broke out the night prior, where students, are literally just shouting at Yale police officers, pigs. They're throwing things at them, and it was, looking at that, it's very hard not to get very viscerally angry and thinking, these are the people who are protecting us. These are the people who are charged with protecting our safety on Yale's campus, and this is how we're treating them. So perhaps on an emotional level, I can get behind, a few different resisting arrest charges or assault of police officer charges, or perhaps just illegally, camping out on campus after you were repeatedly told through a megaphone, you will be arrested for what you're doing, and then students were like genuinely shocked that they were ultimately arrested for it. Yeah.
Do you think there's a moral hazard problem with the way Yale's handled this? Meaning the idea that if someone does something wrong and there are no consequences for those actions, or in certain cases, if they're saved from those actions actively, then they're kind of inspired or incentivized to do it again.
I think that I agree with that, first of all, because I think it sort of enables people to protest in ways that have these sort of negative consequences. But I think on the other hand, I also have a lot of respect for people who are willing to face the consequences for their actions. You know what I mean? If you really believe in what you are espousing so much that you're willing to face the legal consequences for your actions, which do break the law, then I can respect that even if I don't agree with what you're saying. If a lot of these people feel this strongly about these issues, I think they should probably be willing to face the legal consequences for their actions, and that would actually give more force to their cause. I don't really understand how people can expect to break the law and then not have any consequences. Like, why? Because their cause is just? We're not living in a superhero movie, And the other, it's also just like, if we could just decide that we can break laws that we don't agree with, that literally there's no government anymore.
Yeah, well, the whole point of civil disobedience is that you do get punished, right? So if like you said, if you're actually willing to sacrifice for yourself or your cause, follow through on it. I actually find it far more respectable, like you were saying, if you do that, rather than getting all upset about the consequences. I still think that you're a total degenerate who doesn't know what you're talking about and are just heedlessly leading social upheaval that will in no way materialize for the people in Gaza or anybody else for that matter. But yeah, I do think it's more respectable.
So the big question here, one of the, I guess, pulling the two parts of this discussion together, there's the free speech angle, and then there's kind of the parts of the protest that were, I guess, outside of free speech. Obviously, they blocked campus, they blocked traffic, they assaulted people under the guise of free speech. They, I guess, vandalized an American flag that was not theirs under the guise of free speech. But obviously there's a line between the two. How do you guys think about that? Like, how does free speech on Yale's campus exist? What does it look like for you guys? And where do these encampments and protests generally, where do they move out of the realm of free speech?
Yeah, so I think there are probably a lot of different methods of protesting or expressing oneself that could be talked about on a more specific level. But I think it's pretty common sense to say that free speech doesn't excuse outrageous actions. There's a line between saying something and then taking an action that, for example, blocks your peers from entering a public space. So that, as much as I disagree with a lot of the protesters, they are allowed to, walk around, say their beliefs. I think that they're not allowed to then take actions that either break university policy, break the law, or prevent their peers from accessing the same spaces on campus that they have.
Yeah, I mean, there is Supreme Court precedent on this very topic, and there is already the legal basis for time, place, and manner restrictions. So the extent to which a categorical ban on something like an encampment would be appropriate for the university is unlikely, and I probably wouldn't be supportive of it. Former ACLU president, Nadine Strossen, has spoken extensively about this, and I think it's a compelling explanation for me. Nonetheless, I think that the university has to prioritize deterrence in determining those time, place, and manner restrictions to ensure that the campus doesn't go up in flames, right, every single time there's a contentious geopolitical situation. But yeah, I think that there are already very clearly legally defined lines for the exercise of free speech, even on a college campus, and in as much as Yale can abide by those and make it very clear that the university does not endorse any particular position on an issue like Israel-Gaza, then I think we're chilling, as the kids say.
I've always felt, or thinking about this in particular in the context of a campus protest, I've always felt something like free speech means both that you are allowed to express your opinion and I am not required to care, right? To the extent that the advocacy moves beyond you just sharing your opinion and then going home and leaving me to walk around campus, that's no longer free speech. Do you think that, I guess if you were president for a day, president for 6 months or a year, this is tough questions. What if the protests were to come back? How would you guys handle it?
Look, I would do what our current president did at her previous university, which is call in police when people start breaking into buildings and destroying property. I don't think that that's a particularly controversial position for a university to take, that if you're committing crimes, you will in fact face consequences for it. Would I discipline somebody for saying from the river to the sea? No, probably not. I do think that probably would fall under protected speech. I think the people just have to take their meds and read the law and do what we have done for many years now, which is express free speech in a way that's consistent with the law. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Or if they so truly disagree with the law, just be ready to actually, as Owen said, face the consequences for civil disobedience and make that statement, which can be respectable in its own way, but you can't expect the laws not to apply to you because of how you feel.
Yeah.
Well, Arianne, Owen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Now I'd like to turn to our interview with Yale Law School's Keith Whittington, new on the faculty, fresh from Princeton University, to talk about Yale's new public comment guidelines. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Dr. Keith Whittington, the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School and author of several books. Dr. Whittington has spent most of his career at Princeton before joining the Yale Law School this year. Got his master's and PhD here at Yale, so we're lucky to have him back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So you've written 2 books on free speech on campus, numerous essays, commented extensively on it on Twitter, throughout the media and events. Not everyone believes in free speech on campus. How do you think about free speech on campus? And can you give us the quick elevator pitch for your approach?
Sure. So I used to not focus very much on free speech issues or talk about them very much. I mostly took them for granted. But over the last several years, it seemed increasingly the case this was not a topic you could take for granted. And partially that was a result of outside pressures on universities, but also as a result of internal changes on university campuses and a growing number of people, including students, but also faculty on university campuses that were increasingly skeptical about the value of free speech and how expansive it ought to be in a whole variety of contexts. And so it seemed increasingly necessary to be talking more about these issues and focusing my attention more on these issues as we go. And for me, the real reason why that was worth spending my time on is because I think of those free speech issues as central to what universities do. I've dedicated my career to being in universities because they're exciting places to be able to talk about difficult and controversial ideas. And you hope that they are places that allow you the freedom to explore ideas that might not be taken very seriously off campus, or the conversations about those ideas might not be tolerated off campus. But in a university environment, at least traditionally, we were very open to talking about a wide range of problems, that we could explore those ideas very seriously. We simply asked people to bring forward what kinds of evidence and arguments they had about those issues, but we'd hear them out and then try to engage with them. And if we can't do that, then I don't know what we're bothering doing on university campuses at all. We ultimately lose the core central features of what we're up to. We become much less interesting places, but I think also less intellectually stimulating places. They will not have the same kind of scholarly value and the same kind of educational value. And so I think and you can chip that away in sort of less important parts of campuses in some ways. And so I don't think it's crucial necessarily to the educational mission of the university as to what happens when some outside speaker gets invited by some student group to give a talk on campus. But nonetheless, I think if you allow that intellectual environment to be chipped away in those corners of campus, it's going to have wider effects on the ability of the campus to be a place that sustains freewheeling discussions more generally.
So to the student who maybe generally agrees with that, understands free speech, but would go, well, yeah, in practice, it's not so easy. You know, people say horrible things and they say offensive things and they say things that are racist. Why should that, I guess, be an acceptable casualty, or like an acceptable downside of free speech? And why is it still worth having a free speech culture?
Free speech is never easy. And you can see this in all kinds of ways. We can see it sort of in daily practice, of course, of how universities operate, but also how civil society and government operates. But we can also see it in public opinion polls. So social scientists have asked members of the general public, both average citizens, but also members of university faculties, lawyers, elite political actors, so a whole wide range of people. We've poked and prodded with survey instruments over time about free speech issues in particular, as well as sort of related concerns about civil liberties and tolerance in society more generally. And social scientists are particularly concerned about as a consequence of watching European countries fall into autocracies in the early part of the 20th century. So after World War II, social scientists became very concerned about trying to figure out is there sort of similar sources of vulnerability in American society to falling into those kinds of dictatorial political systems. And part of what they wanted to ask about was then how much do people really believe in these kind of liberal values like free speech? And what we have found for decades of research on this is if you ask people, do they care about free speech? Do they value free speech? Left, right, and center, young and old, they tend to say, yes, they care. That at an abstract level, these are all very valuable things. But then if you start asking them more pointed questions about specific kinds of speech that they find particularly controversial or they find particularly threatening or offensive, suddenly they get cold feet. They start finding qualifications. They start carving out exceptions. They find conditions. They say, well, of course I care about free speech, but I don't mean that. And so it's always very hard to get people to translate their abstract commitments to free speech into protecting speech, not of the sort that they find hospitable and easy and agreeable. That speech is easy to protect. The hard part is how do you get them to protect speech that they find disturbing in various kinds of ways. And part of the reason why it's crucial that we protect speech that people find disturbing is because we disagree about what the disturbing speech is. It's precisely in these contexts where the speech is controversial that if you empower somebody to make choices about which speech is beyond the pale, which speech is going to be unacceptable, they're going to make controversial choices about which speech they regard as beyond the pale. The speech that they will want to censor, the speech that they will want to suppress, is precisely the kind of speech that other people think is crucial and needs to be protected. And so we just don't have the kind of societal consensus on what kinds of speech would be out of bounds that we should feel any kind of comfort at all with empowering people to make those choices for us. And so instead, we have, over the last several decades, defaulted to a political regime and a legal regime, but also a culture that just accepts the idea that we're going to tolerate a tremendous amount of speech, including a lot of speech that people find disturbing and offensive and wrongheaded, because the alternatives are just much worse. And I think that fundamental conclusion is still the right one.
So what is the state of free speech on campus? Is it getting more permissible? Is it expanding, contracting, pre-October 7th, post-October 7th? What's your assessment of the state of free speech in the country, on campus specifically?
On the whole, I remain fairly pessimistic, actually, about the state of free speech on college campuses and the tendencies that we're following on this front. But I think there are some little rays of optimism that are out there. So the core pessimism that I have about this is that there's lots of evidence that the campus community generally, not just students, but administrators and faculty alike, have accepted the reasonableness of serious restrictions on speech. They demonstrate that they are much less tolerant of wide-ranging speech than would have been true on college campuses if you did similar kinds of surveys 20 years ago, for example. And there's no sign of that relenting, really. And so I think we've just seen a dramatic cultural change on college campuses. It's not overwhelming. I think it's still an open question as to whether or not we go down that path, but there's a very large minority now on college campuses that would like to suppress speech in various ways. And in many ways, they get to practice that and exercise that power on college campuses. At the same time, we're getting extraordinary pressure from outside college campuses to silence and suppress speech. And there was a little window there where it seemed like people off campus were much more interested in trying to protect speech, or at least there were some very important allies off campuses that were interested in trying to protect more speech on campus. I think that's increasingly shifting. And instead, what we're seeing is a lot of stakeholders off campus who have their own particular versions of speech they would like to suppress. And they bring pressure to bear on universities to follow through with that as well. So that will make it, I think, very difficult for universities to stick up for controversial ideas in that kind of environment. The little rays of hope that I think still exist is that there is some evidence that some people are getting tired of this censorious attitude and are starting to push back more aggressively. I think the last year has been extremely challenging on universities, but one of the things that's been I think helpful is that they have highlighted for a lot of people that there's genuine disagreements on what kind of speech is going to be tolerable and what kind of speech is not going to be tolerable, and that we ought to be therefore cautious about setting up censorship regimes designed to suppress speech. It was easier for, I think, a lot of people on campus to sort of blind themselves to that when they imagined, well, we're all in agreement here about what counts as the bad speech. And so surely it wouldn't be so terrible to adopt some hate speech regulations, for example, where we could all agree on what the hate speech is and we'll just suppress it. And I think one thing the last year has exposed is that there's going to be lots of times when we aren't going to agree on what counts as the hate speech that needs to be suppressed. And I think that's made a lot of people more nervous about the idea of empowering officials to pick and choose which kind of speech they would like to suppress. And so, like I said, the last year has, I think, been very challenging, but I think it may have also been eye-opening for some people. And maybe in the long term, that will be helpful. I think some universities have gotten much more serious about trying to think through their free expression policies on campus and make some policy changes. We've certainly seen a lot of universities modify their policies about institutional statements on political events on campus. And so I think there's been a little bit of soul searching on campuses, and that may lead in positive directions down the road. But I don't think we're there yet. It'll be a long fight, I think, to get us into a better place. But at least there are still some signs that things can improve.
So you mentioned that some universities have taken steps to change institutional neutrality or affect how they make public comments. Yale is one of those places. President Maury McGinnis, new president, a few months back convened a committee on institutional voice to look at this question. The committee came out with a report, including recommended guidelines, which she accepted. They were emphatic that it did not count as institutional neutrality. So before we kind of get into nitty-gritty of the guidelines, can you just talk through what is institutional neutrality and whether you think it's important?
Yeah, so the basic terminology of institutional neutrality really comes out of the University of Chicago. This is a very long-standing set of commitments and traditions they have really from the very beginning of the foundation of the University of Chicago. At the end of the 19th century, they had debates about to what degree should university officials or the faculty senate be issuing public statements about controversial political and social issues in general. This got reaffirmed by them through the so-called Calvin Report, which was a committee chaired by the First Amendment scholar Harry Calvin in the early 1970s that was asked to evaluate on behalf of the university whether or not the university should be more willing to take positions on contentious social issues. In part, there were student demands that the university take more political positions, most immediately about South Africa, but also a variety of other issues that were percolating at the time. And the Calvin Report sort of came down firmly on the side of saying the university ought to remain, as it characterized it, neutral about those political and social issues. And so this kind of language about neutrality really arises out of these Chicago debates in particular, with the idea being that universities should not take positions on most controversial social and political debates that are occurring in society as a whole. Instead, universities ought to be a platform on which those debates take place. The universities are places in which members of the campus community can disagree about those social issues, can themselves as individuals comment on those issues, but the institution will simply provide the platform, but will not reach conclusions about those political and social issues. The Calvin Report, though, and this sort of idea of institutional neutrality has always had some exceptions and qualifications built into it. And there are real debates about sort of how big those exceptions ought to be and how we ought to understand them. Notably, it emphasized that things that immediately affect university operations and policies, the university, by its very nature, can't be neutral about them. So, for example, if the university has adopted some kind of affirmative action policy for student admissions to the university, for example, the university can't be silent when there are public policy questions about whether or not universities ought to continue to have affirmative action going forward. The university has an interest in defending the policies it already has about how to conduct its own admissions policy. So public policy debates about how university activities ought to be conducted, universities are going to have a stake in, and they're going to have to be able to take positions on those one way or another. Likewise, there's a second kind of category that is very similar, but I think somewhat more expansive, of thinking that universities need to be committed to a general principle of intellectual freedom. And to the extent that that's being debated in the public square, universities have to defend their own mission and the kind of liberal tolerance that is crucial to the university mission.
So, what do you think of Yale's new guidelines? A step in the right direction, and also kind of building on that, like why they were emphatic in the report's authors, that this wasn't institutional neutrality. Why do you think they didn't want to take that step?
Well, at this point, so I can't speak for the authors of the report and what exactly they're thinking about this. It strikes me that the report they drafted essentially is institutional neutrality as broadly conceived, and it mostly mirrors the kinds of policies that are being advocated by those who support institutional neutrality. Fundamentally, I don't care much about what language you use to describe the report. What I care about is what the substance looks like. And the substance of the report, I think, is pretty good about what its recommendations are to the president, that they emphasize that the university as an institution should not be taking positions on issues unnecessarily. And so things that directly affect university operations, the university has an obligation and a need to be able to speak out about them. But if they don't directly affect university operations, then the university should be quiet and aggressively defend the ability of individual members of the community to speak out on those issues. I am confident that there will be both temptations to depart from that, but also some gray areas about does a particular kind of comment, particular kind of issue fall within one of the exceptions, or is it the kind of thing the university ought to be silent about? I'm sure the university is going to make mistakes in both directions. Sometimes they'll probably be silent when they should have been willing to speak up, and sometimes they're probably going to speak up when they probably should have been silent. But that's the way it goes. But I think directionally, at least, it points in the right direction and will be helpful in both providing guidance for the president and providing a bit of an anchor. So when there are pressures on the university president to speak out about things, it will both provide a reminder to the president that she probably shouldn't, but also will provide her with something that she can point to and say, well, look, no matter how sympathetic I might be with this particular issue, we have this rule in place, and I need to stick to it in general, and that's a helpful thing for university presidents can easily find themselves buffeted by the passions of the moment.
So the new guidelines did get a lot of praise. FIRE did express praise, and the Buckley Institute, where the host of this podcast, also said there are positive signs here, but they both organizations pointed out to one caveat in particular. In her email talking about accepting the report, President McGinnis pointed to the idea that the university should comment on transcendent issues. And if you look at the language of the report, it says that, when they do comment on these issues, broadly described, still avoid taking a partisan stance on that. FIRE called this a loophole that's ripe for abuse. Buckley's executive director, Lauren Noble, she pointed out that this kind of caveat relies on the judgment of the same people who created the need for this report, this move to institutional neutrality in the first place. So how much can we rely on it? So what do you think of this loophole as FIRE described it? Do you think it's a problem, or I guess, how do you view this particular part of the new guidelines?
Yeah, I think it's a fair concern. I think on the whole, it doesn't bother me too much yet. I think the way to think about these kinds of institutional neutrality policies is less as legalistic rules that are going to tie the hands of universities than as prudential guidelines for universities to pursue. They have some rule-like qualities, and in particular, they are helpful in the university making some determinations about what can subunits of the university or what can lower level administrators and officials say about things, for example. And then you sort of need some rules in place to say, how can you use the university website? How can you use the university social media accounts and that kind of stuff? When it comes to the president herself, though, in particular, and what kinds of statements she makes, and likewise, I think provosts and deans similarly, it's ultimately going to be less about rules and much more about prudential guidance. And then the question is, okay, what are the principles here? What's the standard by which the president ought to be guided? And I'm less concerned, I think, about what the particular details of the language look like than what direction it's pointing to. And then we can fight these fights on a one-by-one basis. And so if it turns out that the president decides, well, we're encountering transcendent issues all the time, and so I just constantly have to be issuing messages because this one's really, really important, and I'm going to say it falls within the scope of this particular so-called loophole, then we're going to have a problem, and we should talk about that at the time, and we should say, no, that's a departure from the purpose of this. And it's going to invite all the problems that we were trying to avoid. And so we need to be thinking about how to ratchet that back down and construe this more narrowly. And how do we get the president to sit on the sidelines more often? From my perspective, this goes back again to sort of the purposes of why you want to be neutral as an institution in the first place. And I think there are sort of two kinds of big concerns that ought to hover over this, and as a consequence, ought to guide a president when they're contemplating, is this one of these moments where I ought to issue a statement despite the fact that in general I ought to be fairly quiet? And those two purposes are partially, I think, concern about what the institutional risk is of being more politicized. That we operate in a very polarized political environment in which people are paying close attention to what happens on university campuses. And it's simply not helpful for universities as institutions to enter that environment with an attitude that it's okay for us to be political actors, and that we ought to be politicized institutions making political statements and picking fights in that political arena. If you're going to go out picking fights in political arenas, you should not be surprised if your opposition decides to fight back. And ultimately, university is going to lose that fight. And so I think we need to pick our battles very carefully. And among the battles we should not be picking is how do we make symbolic statements that accomplish no particular purposes except to anger people that we disagree with, and make the people who agree with us feel better about issuing those statements. And so I think university presidents, as they're thinking about, do I need to really be issuing this statement, have to be thinking very carefully about what's going to be accomplished by making this statement, and what are the risks of making this statement. And most of the time, I think if they actually go through that calculation, they will find this is not a statement worth making. I should sit back. The other kind of concern is one about academic freedom on the campus itself, that if the university is picking sides on social and political debates, rather than simply saying we're just a platform on which people have those debates, then it will ultimately have consequences of trying to silence and suppress and discourage people who are on the so-called losing sides of those debates in the campus community. And we will get less robust debates on campus, including less robust scholarly debates on campus. And that's not helpful to fulfilling the mission of the campus. And so, again, I think a university president who is contemplating whether or not to issue a statement on something ought to think very carefully about, are there people on this campus who are going to disagree with the substance of the statement I'm about to make? And if there are, then they should have some real second thoughts about whether or not that's a statement they ought to be making.
So to her credit, President McInnes didn't comment on the election, even though she was asked, and I saw that, and I was like, I don't know. She said that was her common practice, but maybe it was a good sign for kind of commitment to neutrality. Do you, as a new professor here at Yale, though you obviously have a lot of experience at Yale, do these guidelines, President McInnes not chiming in on the election, does it give you more confidence in free speech at Yale? Change nothing, or are you still concerned about how things will be going forward?
No, I think it's helpful. I think it's very easy to imagine in the past that you would have issued a statement about this election outcome, and not just a statement about We had an election, and hooray for democratic processes and ideals. And we look forward to moving on with our democracy. And instead, statements about we're all very disappointed by how the election came out. And so I'm encouraged that the university didn't feel the need to issue a statement saying we're all just very disappointed about how the election came out. And so that's encouraging. And it's one hurdle the universities have gotten over that they might have tripped over in the past. I think that's a pretty low bar to get over that particular hurdle. But and I'm sure there'll be many more challenging ones coming down the road. But we'll take them one by one and see how we go on that front. I do think, though, and thinking about this sort of institutionality question, this does raise one of the sort of gray areas where universities, I think, can make mistakes, both in terms of saying too much, but also saying too little. And that is, I've seen some complaining that the university didn't issue the kind of congratulatory statement about its own alum becoming the elected vice president of the United States. And if it's the case that normally the university would acknowledge at least the political accomplishments of its alumni, then it ought to do that on a consistent basis. It shouldn't pick and choose and say, oh, well, now we're going to sit silently if there's some alums who win political office, but other alums we're really going to celebrate them. But I think also people need to give a little grace about this kind of messaging. And with the new president, we should also recognize it's a new policy in place, a new administration. They're trying to set their own precedents and practices about how to behave on these things going forward. And so in some ways, it's also not helpful to us to look back and say, well, 4 years ago, Yale would have done something different than what they are doing right now. Part of the point is to say we should be doing things differently moving forward than how we did in the past. And again, I think then the question we ought to be asking each time a statement gets issued or doesn't get issued is saying, okay, is this going to be helpful to the mission of the university and the purpose of the university, or is it not?
Well, thanks so much for joining us on Pod and Mail. I appreciate Pod and Man at Yale. I appreciate you making some time for us today.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
That wraps up another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. We're trying out a new length, so let us know if you like it. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.